Greetings, fellow explorers and armchair cartographers. Have you ever looked at a map, a really detailed one, and then seen the actual ground and realized something massive was just missing? Or maybe found something incredible you were certain everyone knew about, only to find it was your own little secret? My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I'm retired now. Spent 40 years pushing lines around on paper and screens, first as a land surveyor, then later dabbling in GIS and remote sensing for various firms. Maps have always been more than just tools to me. They're narratives, stories told in contours and symbols. They're supposed to be comprehensive, objective records of reality. That's why, when I stumbled onto what I did, out in the loneliest stretches of West Texas, it felt less like a discovery and more like finding a fundamental error in the established text, a missing paragraph in the planet's own biography. My retirement hobby was supposed to be relaxing. High-resolution satellite imagery, comparing different data sets, flying my drone over places I used to survey on foot decades ago just to see how they'd changed. It was a way to keep my eye in, I suppose. A comfortable routine. I'd picked a section of land way out past Marathon, past the point where pavement felt like a distant memory, an area officially designated on most maps as little more than vast ranches and rugged, uninteresting terrain. The sort of place where the elevation lines spread out, suggesting gentle slopes or flattish plains, punctuated by the occasional known peak or dry creek bed. I was cross-referencing some recent Sentinel-2 data with older Landsat images and overlaying them onto USGS topographical maps from the 90s. Just standard practice, really. Looking for subtle changes in vegetation, new tracks, anything that caught the eye. It was mind-numbingly routine, perfect for easing into my golden years. But then I saw it. Not a change, but an absence. Or rather, the satellite image showed a feature that the topo map simply ignored. It was subtle at first glance, easily dismissed as a trick of light or shadow in the image. A slight concavity in what the map insisted was relatively flat upland terrain near a minor, unnamed mesa. But the more I zoomed, the more I adjusted contrast and processed the spectral bands, the clearer it became. It was a depression, a significant one, and it had structure. A circular or slightly oval rim with a noticeable drop towards the center. I estimated the diameter initially. Maybe a few hundred meters, I thought. Strange, certainly, that a feature of that size wouldn't be marked, maybe as a sinkhole or a natural depression, but not entirely impossible in such a remote region on older maps. I pulled up the latest digital elevation models, DEMs, I had access to, hoping for a clearer picture. These are generated from satellite radar or photogrammetry and should show elevation changes quite accurately, even subtle ones. The DM confirmed it. There was a definite dip. But the resolution of that particular public DEM wasn't fantastic for that specific spot. It showed a vague bowl shape, maybe 50 to 70 meters deep in places, but the edges were fuzzy. It wasn't a gentle sag. It looked like a sharp, almost abrupt change in elevation. My surveyor's brain started buzzing. How could a feature with that kind of depth gradient, spanning several hundred meters, be completely absent from the topographic record? I started digging deeper. I checked older geological surveys of the area. Nothing. Soil maps. Nothing unusual. Groundwater reports. No mention of major karst features or sinkhole-prone areas that would suggest a collapse structure of this scale. I spent days glued to my screens downloading any scrap of data I could find relating to that specific set of coordinates. I even tried looking for aerial photos from the 1950s and 60s, the kind oil companies sometimes commissioned. They were grainy, difficult to work with, but they seemed to show something in that spot, even back then. A patch of ground that looked different, maybe a slightly darker shade or an odd textural pattern compared to the surrounding scrubland. It wasn't conclusive, not by any stretch, but it added another layer to the mystery. The estimated size kept bothering me. A few hundred meters diameter with a drop of 50 meters isn't insignificant. It's larger than many known geological features that are routinely mapped and named. I began to suspect my initial estimate might be low, distorted by the oblique angle of the satellite pass or the limited resolution. I needed better data. Fortunately, my retirement funds had stretched to a decent drone, a DJI mattress with a good camera, and more importantly, a reliable GPS and obstacle avoidance system. I could use it for aerial photogrammetry to create my own high-resolution 3D model of the area. But that required being on site, or at least close enough to launch. The coordinates I'd pinpointed were deep within private ranch land, miles from any public road or even a commonly used track. Access would be a significant problem. And there was still the nagging doubt. Was I just seeing things? Was it some known, mundane feature that just happened to be poorly documented? A quarry, perhaps? But quarries usually have associated infrastructure visible from the air. A natural amphitheater eroded by water? Possible, but the regularity of the shape in the satellite images didn't scream water erosion in this arid environment. A volcanic maar? Unlikely in Texas, but not entirely impossible for ancient geological events. A meteorite impact crater. The shape was right, but usually these leave telltale geological signs. And surely, a confirmed impact crater of any size would be mapped and studied. The lack of any official record was the most confounding part. It wasn't just unnamed. It was unaccounted for. Like a mountain peak that simply didn't appear on the Everest map. The feeling grew from mild curiosity to a persistent, low-grade obsession. I started sketching the anomaly on printouts of the official maps, drawing a dotted line circle where the data said it should be. A ghost feature. A phantom geography. I spent hours poring over Google Earth, using its 3D terrain view, which usually incorporates DM data. Even there, at higher zoom levels, the topography looked smoother, less defined over that spot than the satellite image suggested it should be if the DM was accurately reflecting the feature I was seeing. It was almost like the public data sets had been smoothed over that specific point, erasing the finer details of the terrain. That thought, that possibility of data being deliberately obscured or simplified, sent a shiver down my spine. It felt conspiratorial, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist by nature. I prefer data, hard evidence. But the lack of evidence, where it should be, was starting to feel like evidence in itself. Was this a military site? A classified test range? Unlikely in this particular area, far from any known bases. But the thought crossed my mind. Was it something dangerous, cordoned off and forgotten? Or was it simply so remote, on private land whose owners preferred privacy, that it had genuinely escaped official notice despite its size? That last possibility, while mundane, felt the most plausible. Landowners out here value their solitude. If they had a giant hole on their property, perhaps they just saw it as an obstacle, fenced it off, and never bothered telling anyone official. Why invite geologists, tourists, or government regulators onto your land? I leaned towards this explanation, but it didn't fully satisfy the surveyor in me. A feature of this magnitude felt like it demanded to be on the map, to be acknowledged. It felt like a part of the land's identity was being erased. The coordinates were burned into my memory. 30 Dixwa N 103 degrees. Series of numbers representing a place that, according to the official story, didn't really exist in the way my data suggested. The decision to go became inevitable. I had to see it with my own eyes. I had to put my boots on the ground, or at least get my drone over it, to understand what was truly there. The preparation would be significant. This wasn't a day trip. It was hundreds of miles of driving, followed by uncertain access issues and the need to be self-sufficient in a harsh, unforgiving environment. Water, food, fuel, communication equipment, and of course, my surveying gear and the drone. I started planning the logistics meticulously, the way I would for a serious survey expedition in my working life. Permission would be the biggest hurdle. Finding the landowner was the first step, and that information wasn't always easy to get for vast, old ranches held in trusts or by absentee owners. I knew enough about Texas land records to know it could be a long, frustrating process, potentially ending in a polite no. But the pull of the mystery was too strong. I started packing my truck. I downloaded high-resolution satellite images of the surrounding area, marking potential access points, old ranch roads that might be visible but potentially gated, washes that might be traversable. The landscape around the anomaly looked typical for the region: sparse mesquite and creosote bush, rocky outcrops, dry arroyos carving through the terrain. Nothing in the immediate vicinity suggested a cause for a massive depression. No nearby mountains that could have collapsed. No major fault lines mapped directly through the spot. It made the feature even more anomalous, sitting out there in relatively unremarkable terrain. I double-checked my gear. GPS units, satellite phone, cell service would be non-existent. Plenty of batteries for the drone and other electronics, camera equipment, first aid kit, emergency supplies. I estimated I'd need at least 3 days in the area to conduct a proper initial investigation, depending on access. That meant carrying everything I'd need. The weight of my backpack, even just preparing it, felt heavy with the weight of the unknown. What was I actually going to find? A natural oddity? Something artificial and abandoned? Or something else entirely? The official maps offered no clues. Just a blank space where a significant geological feature appeared to exist. That blankness felt like a challenge, a silent dare from the land itself. It promised a story if I was willing to go find it. My old Ford F-250 was packed tight. Water jugs, camping gear, surveying instruments. A good quality differential GPS capable of centimeter accuracy if I could get a clear signal, a laser rangefinder, clinometers, a compass, never trust electronics entirely, rock hammer, out of habit more than expectation of needing samples on the first trip, notepads, and plenty of pens. The drone, of course, in its padded case, with 6 battery packs and a portable charging station powered by the truck's battery. Driving west out of San Antonio, the landscape slowly changed. The rolling hills eventually flattened out into the vast open spaces that define West Texas. The towns grew smaller, farther apart. The sky seemed to get bigger, the sun harsher. This is a land of immense distances and profound solitude. It's easy to feel insignificant here, swallowed up by the sheer scale of the landscape. That feeling, however, was precisely why I could believe something as large as the feature I suspected could remain undocumented. In a state as big as Texas, with vast tracts of private land larger than some small countries, official surveys often stick to public roads, utility corridors, and areas of specific resource interest. Remote, privately held rangeland, especially if it's not ranching prime cattle country or sitting on an oil field, can easily be overlooked or only surveyed at a very coarse level. My destination was south and west of Fort Stockton, deep in the Trans-Pecos region, closer to the Big Bend area than anything else, but not within the national park boundaries. Just empty space on the map, crisscrossed by property lines established decades ago. My first objective was to get as close as possible via public roads or known, traversable tracks, and then use the drone for a high-level reconnaissance. I'd spent the last few weeks trying to identify the specific ranch the feature was on. This involved poring over online county appraisal district maps, which are often outdated or inaccurate in depicting actual boundaries on the ground. But they give ownership information. It seemed the anomaly straddled the boundaries of at least 2, possibly 3, large ranches. This complicated things significantly. Getting permission from one owner is hard enough. Getting it from multiple, potentially uninterested or suspicious parties felt almost impossible on my first speculative trip. I decided the most realistic approach for this initial phase was to avoid direct contact and instead focus on observing from adjacent public or less strictly controlled access points, using the drone as my eyes. I wasn't planning on trespassing just yet, but finding a legal launch point within range would be crucial. The drive took the better part of a day. As I got closer, the air grew drier, the heat more intense even in the spring. The vegetation thinned out further. More rocks, more dust, less green. I spent the first night in a small, nondescript motel in a town whose main feature seemed to be a single gas station and a blinking traffic light. The next morning, I headed south on a paved highway that quickly turned into a county-maintained Calichet road, then deteriorated into a barely there track, marked on my paper map as a primitive road. This track followed a fence line that, according to my appraisal district maps, was the boundary between 2 enormous ranches. The feature was located roughly a mile or 2 inward from this boundary, entirely within one property. But the fence line offered a potential launch point for my drone without crossing onto private land. The track was punishing on the truck, requiring slow, careful driving to avoid punctures and broken suspension parts. After about an hour of bone-jarring progress, the track seemed to fade into the landscape, becoming indistinguishable from a dry wash. I stopped the truck, checked my GPS coordinates. I was roughly 2 miles east of the suspected location of the crater rim. This was as far as I could get without definitely trespassing or getting the truck seriously stuck. I was surrounded by nothing but miles of scrubland stretching to the horizon. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind and the distant buzz of insects. The sense of isolation was immediate and complete. This was precisely the kind of place where things could be hidden. I unloaded my gear, set up a small collapsible table and prepared the drone for launch. I laid out the battery packs, controller, and my tablet, which would serve as the drone's display and control interface. My heart rate picked up a little. This was it. The moment of truth. Would the drone footage confirm the anomaly and its scale? Or would it reveal that I had misinterpreted the satellite data? Chasing a mirage? I performed the pre-flight checks meticulously, calibrated the compass, checked the GPS signal strength, surprisingly good out here, clear view of the sky, ensured the camera settings were correct for high-resolution stills and video. I double-checked the flight plan I had pre-programmed into the drone's software, a grid pattern that would cover the suspected location from multiple angles and altitudes, designed for creating a 3D photogrammetry model later. The drone lifted off with its characteristic whine, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the vast silence. I watched it climb on the tablet screen, a small dot rising into the enormous sky. I guided it towards the coordinates, keeping an eye on its altitude and speed. The range was well within the drone's capabilities, but controlling it over unfamiliar, featureless terrain required concentration. As the drone approached the target area, the live camera feed on my tablet started to show the ground changing. The relatively flat, rocky scrubland began to curve downwards. The change wasn't immediately dramatic from 400 feet up, but it was unmistakable. The vegetation seemed slightly different within the depression, perhaps denser in some spots, or a different color. As the drone continued its programmed flight path, orbiting the central point I'd identified, the full scale of the feature began to reveal itself on the screen. It wasn't just a dip. It was a colossal bowl scooped out of the earth. The edges were defined, though not perfectly sheer, sloping downwards into the depths. Sunlight caught the slopes, highlighting wrinkles and gullies running down towards the floor. My initial estimate of a few hundred meters diameter felt laughably small now. This was easily a kilometer across, perhaps more. The depth, estimated from the drone's altitude relative to the rim, looked to be well over 100 meters in places. A feature of this size and depth is absolutely, unequivocally, a significant geological formation. It was impossible that it wasn't on any official map. The sheer scale of the undocumented feature was breathtaking. It was a giant thumbprint pressed into the landscape, a secret held by the earth itself. My hands trembled slightly as I controlled the drone, ensuring it stayed on its flight path, capturing the necessary data. The camera fed back stunning images of the rim, the slopes, and the relatively flat floor of the depression. It wasn't perfectly round, slightly elongated, maybe hinting at an oblique impact or a complex collapse structure. The rim wasn't a sharp lip everywhere. In places it seemed eroded or broken, suggesting age. Within the bowl, there were smaller undulations, perhaps terraces or slumped material from the walls. The vegetation on the floor looked different again, possibly due to trapped moisture or different soil composition. It was a micro-environment within the vast macro-environment of the Texas desert. This was not a mirage. It was real, and it was massive. How could this have been missed? How could it have been left off every map I'd ever seen? The questions hammered in my head as I completed the photogrammetry flight, ensuring overlapping images and consistent altitude. The drone beeped, indicating low battery, pulling me back to the task at hand. I carefully piloted it back towards my location near the fence line, the whine of its rotors growing louder as it approached. Landing it safely, I immediately started reviewing the footage and images on the tablet screen. Zooming in on the high-resolution stills confirmed the details I'd seen in the live feed. Exposed rock layers were visible on the slopes, different from the surface rocks around the rim. There were signs of erosion, gullies carrying runoff down into the basin. The floor looked relatively flat in the center with a few small clumps of what looked like denser vegetation. It was a self-contained world. The reality of the discovery settled over me, heavy and exciting. I had found something truly remarkable, something the official record denied existed. The journey here, the hours of research, the doubts, they all vanished in the face of this undeniable visual evidence. I packed the drone away carefully, the memory cards filled with terabytes of data representing the first true mapping of this hidden feature. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a spectacular light show common in this part of the world. But my attention was fixed on the coordinates on my GPS, the spot on the landscape that was, officially, just more empty space. It felt like I had just peered into a secret room the world didn't know about. I knew I couldn't leave it at this. I had to get closer. I had to attempt to enter the depression, to walk its floor, to measure its dimensions precisely, to understand its geology. The challenge of access remained, but the motivation had just multiplied tenfold. This wasn't just a mapping anomaly anymore. It was a profound geographical mystery, sitting silently in the Texas desert, waiting to be explored. The data from the drone flights was clearer back in my temporary base in the motel room. I processed the images into a preliminary 3D model using photogrammetry software on my laptop. The results were stunning. The depression was indeed roughly elliptical, its longest axis pointing roughly northeast-southwest. My initial airborne estimate was confirmed. It was approximately 1.2 kilometers, about 3/4 of a mile, across at its widest point, and around 0.9 kilometers at its narrowest. The maximum depth, measured from the highest point on the rim to the lowest point on the floor in the 3D model, was a staggering 145 meters, nearly 475 feet. To put that in perspective, that's deeper than many urban skyscrapers are tall and wider than several city blocks. A feature of this magnitude is impossible to overlook during any comprehensive survey, unless it was deliberately omitted, or the surveys were simply too coarse, or the area was intentionally avoided. The 3D model allowed me to examine the topography in detail. The slopes leading down from the rim varied in steepness. In some sections, they were relatively gentle, covered in what looked like loose rock and scrub. In other areas, particularly on the southern and western sides, there appeared to be steeper cliffs or rocky outcrops exposed on the slopes. These exposed areas were key. They might reveal the underlying geology and offer clues to the formation's origin. The floor of the depression looked relatively flat in the center, but with undulating terrain towards the edges where the slopes met the bottom. There were what looked like dry drainage channels running from the rim slopes down into the center, suggesting that during rare rain events, water collects on the floor. This might explain the slightly different vegetation patterns I'd observed. There was no sign of a central peak, which is sometimes found in larger impact craters due to the rebound of rock after the initial compression, but its absence didn't rule out an impact. Complex craters, especially older eroded ones, can have less pronounced central structures. I spent hours rotating the 3D model, examining it from every angle, comparing it to geological maps of the wider region, looking for any correlation or hint. The geology of this part of Texas is primarily sedimentary rock layers, limestones, sandstones, shales, laid down over millions of years, subsequently uplifted and eroded. There are some igneous intrusions, volcanic rock, in the wider Trans-Pecos region, forming mountains like the Davis Mountains, but they are generally further west and north. The rock exposed in the slopes of the depression seemed consistent with layered sedimentary rocks, visible as distinct benches or changes in slope. This suggested the depression cut down through these existing layers. This feature didn't look like a volcano. The shape was wrong, and there was no sign of volcanic rock or structure. A massive sinkhole was a possibility, but the size and relatively regular rim were less typical of sinkholes, which often have more irregular outlines and can form suddenly. A collapse structure due to underground dissolution is plausible, but the scale here was immense, suggesting an incredibly large void beneath. An impact crater remained a strong contender. The elliptical shape could be explained by an oblique impact angle. The raised rim structure visible in the elevation data is characteristic of impact craters. The exposed layered rocks would be the result of the impact excavating through the existing stratigraphy. I leaned towards an impact origin, but without geological samples from the floor or central uplift, if there was a subtle one. It was speculation. The next phase required getting closer. The property line I had launched the drone from offered decent visibility of the northern rim, but to truly understand the feature, I needed to get onto the property and ideally, down into the depression. I spent another day researching the landowners. It confirmed my initial findings. 2 large ranches, primarily owned by distant holding companies or families with addresses in major cities far from West Texas. Contacting them formally, explaining I was a retired surveyor who had found an off-map crater on their land and wanted permission to explore, felt like a guaranteed way to get shut down. They might fear liability, unwanted attention, or simply value their privacy above all else. A formal request could take months, if it was even considered. I decided on a less conventional approach for this initial exploratory phase. I would attempt to find a way to approach the area from a different angle, perhaps where the fencing was less secure, or where a natural feature like a wash or arroyo offered a potential less conspicuous route towards the rim. My maps showed a significant dry wash that cut across the northwestern edge of one of the ranches, flowing roughly towards the crater. These washes, while technically private property, are often unfenced and serve as natural pathways for wildlife and sometimes discreet human passage, ranch hands checking fences, hunters, etc. If I could access that wash from a distant public road or easement, I might be able to follow it towards the feature. This approach wasn't without risk. Trespassing is illegal, and ranchers in Texas are known for being protective of their land. Confrontation was something I desperately wanted to avoid. I decided to focus on the northwestern approach. I drove the truck further down the primitive road I'd been on, looking for any turnoff or break in the fence that might align with the wash I'd identified on the map. I found an old, rusted gate set back from the main fence line, partially obscured by bushes. It wasn't locked, just wired shut with thick gauge wire that looked years old. It was clearly not a frequently used entrance. This might be my opportunity. I parked the truck a good distance away, off the track and behind some dense brush, hoping it wouldn't be visible from the air or the track. I spent an hour carefully unwiring the gate, making as little noise and disturbance as possible. I swung it open just enough to slip through, then wired it shut again, trying to make it look undisturbed. I felt a pang of guilt. I was trespassing, plain and simple. But the scientific curiosity, the pull of the unknown, outweighed the ethical discomfort at that moment. This felt too important to ignore. Carrying a lighter pack this time, water, some food, my handheld GPS, camera, and a satellite phone for emergencies, I started walking, following the faint signs of the old track beyond the gate, which seemed to lead vaguely in the direction of the wash. The terrain was rough, uneven, covered in thorny bushes and sharp rocks. Every step required attention. The sun beat down relentlessly. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the buzz of flies. I checked my GPS frequently, orienting myself towards the dry wash. After about an hour of walking, I found it. A wide, shallow depression in the land, its floor covered in loose sand and gravel, winding its way through the landscape. The banks were undercut in places, showing layers of sediment. This was definitely the wash I'd seen on the maps. Following the wash bed was easier walking than fighting through the brush, though the sand was soft in places. The high banks on either side offered some concealment. I estimated the crater was now only a couple of miles away, based on my GPS and the drone data. I kept a sharp eye out for any signs of recent human activity, tire tracks, footprints, anything that would indicate the ranch hands or owners were in the vicinity. I saw only animal tracks, deer, coyotes, smaller critters. The remoteness felt absolute. As I walked, the landscape gradually changed. The wash deepened slightly, and the terrain to my left, south, seemed to rise subtly. This rise corresponded to the outer slope of the massive depression I was heading towards. The land wasn't flat leading up to the rim. It was a gentle uplift, perhaps part of the structure created by the impact or collapse event. This outer rise is also characteristic of impact craters. The feeling of approaching something significant grew with every step. The air seemed different, heavier perhaps, or just my imagination. The silence felt more intense. After another hour, the wash curved sharply, and as I rounded a bend, I saw it. Not the rim itself, but the land rising significantly ahead and to my left. This was the edge of the giant feature. I left the wash, moving carefully through the brush towards the rising ground, keeping low. I didn't want to skyline myself on the rim. The vegetation changed slightly as I gained elevation, becoming sparser, the ground rockier. The climb was gradual but steady. My legs burned, and I was grateful for the water I was carrying. I reached what felt like the top of the rise, stopping just short of where the ground began to dip downwards. I crawled the last few feet, peering over the edge. The view was breathtaking. Peering over the rim was like looking into another world. The ground didn't just slope away. It plunged downwards, forming a vast, circular amphitheater below me. The scale was even more impressive from ground level than it had been from the drone footage. The walls of the depression, curving away to my left and right, stretched for what seemed like miles. The floor, far below, was a complex mosaic of textures and colors, hinting at varied terrain and vegetation. The rim itself wasn't uniform. Where I lay, the edge was relatively rounded, a crest of ground where the subtle outer rise peaked before dropping steeply inward. But looking along the circumference, I could see sections where the rim appeared sharper, almost cliff-like, and other areas where it seemed more broken and eroded. This suggested variations in the underlying rock structure or differential erosion over time. The immediate slope below me was steep, covered in loose scree, small angular rocks and gravel, interspersed with hardy desert plants clinging precariously to the incline. Larger boulders were scattered further down. Descending here would be tricky, requiring careful footing. The air temperature seemed to drop noticeably as I looked into the depression, perhaps due to the shaded slopes or simply the sheer volume of air contained within the bowl. The silence here was different again. It wasn't just the absence of man-made noise. It was a deep, natural quiet, amplifying the sounds of the wind whispering over the rim and the occasional chirp of a bird. The sense of profound isolation was overwhelming. I felt incredibly small and insignificant at the edge of this vast, hidden void. Pulling back slightly from the edge, I sat and took out my notebook and camera. I spent the next hour documenting the view, taking panoramic photos, sketching the visible geological layers in the opposite wall, and making notes on the vegetation and terrain. I used my laser rangefinder to shoot distances to various points on the floor and the opposite rim, confirming the general dimensions I'd calculated from the drone data. The floor seemed to be roughly 150 meters below my position on the rim. The distance across the depression to the opposite side varied depending on the angle, but the rangefinder confirmed distances of 900 meters to over 1,200 meters within the main bowl. This was a giant crater, and it was completely undocumented on any official map I possessed. The question of why still loomed large. Was it simply the remoteness and private ownership? Was there something more? My eyes scanned the floor of the depression, looking for anything unusual. I saw clumps of denser green vegetation, particularly towards the center, suggesting moisture might accumulate there. There were also lighter patches, possibly dried mudflats or areas of different soil composition. I couldn't see any obvious signs of human habitation or recent activity from this vantage point. No structures, no roads, no tracks that looked recent. The scale swallowed up any minor features. I decided I needed to find a way down. The slope directly below me looked too unstable for a solo descent without ropes, and I hadn't brought climbing gear. I walked along the rim, moving carefully, searching for a less steep section or a break in the wall that might offer a traversable route. The rim walk itself was challenging. The ground was uneven, rocky, and the thorny brush snagged at my clothes. I had to constantly refer to my GPS and the drone model on my tablet to stay oriented and ensure I was following the actual crest of the rim, which wasn't always obvious on the ground. After about half a mile, I found a section that looked more promising. A major gully or arroyo, eroded by rainwater runoff, cut down from the rim towards the floor. It was still steep and filled with loose rock, but the presence of established water channels suggested it might be stable enough to descend carefully, following the path water would take during a storm. It looked like the most natural route down. I checked my supplies. Plenty of water left, some snacks. The sun was still high, giving me several hours of daylight. I decided to attempt the descent. The first few steps down the gully were tentative. The ground was indeed loose, and small rocks skittered away, bouncing down the slope. I used my hands to steady myself against the sides of the gully, which were composed of layered sedimentary rock, visible strata of sandstone, shale, and perhaps some limestone, laid down flat and then cut through by the erosion and the original formation event. This layering was confirmation that the feature cut through existing bedrock, supporting both the impact and collapse theories. As I descended, the perspective changed again. The walls of the depression loomed higher and steeper around me. The world outside the rim disappeared, replaced by the enclosing slopes and the sky overhead. The air grew stiller, protected from the wind that blew across the open rangeland. It felt increasingly like being inside a massive, natural amphitheater. The descent was slow and required constant concentration. I had to pick each foothold carefully, testing the ground before committing my weight. The sounds of my own movements, the scraping of boots, the dislodging of rocks, seemed loud in the quiet space. I saw signs of animal life, scat, tracks, and small lizards darting among the rocks. This was clearly habitat, a sheltered haven within the harsh desert. After what felt like an hour but was probably less, I reached the floor of the depression. The terrain here was different again. The loose scree from the slopes gave way to a mix of sand, finer gravel, and patches of more consolidated clay-like soil, particularly in the lower areas that would likely hold water after rain. The vegetation was noticeably different from the rim and outer slopes. While still dominated by hardy desert species, there were larger clumps of grass, different types of bushes, and even a few small trees, mesquite or palo verde, tough survivors, growing in sheltered spots. It felt slightly cooler, more humid even, than the rim. I took a moment to catch my breath and take in the surroundings from this new perspective. Standing on the floor, looking up at the towering walls, the scale felt overwhelming. The sky overhead was just a circle defined by the rim. It was an enclosed world, hidden from the vastness of the surrounding plains. I was standing inside the anomaly, the giant feature that maps had forgotten. My GPS confirmed my position. I was at the coordinates I'd studied for weeks, but in a place that, according to official records, shouldn't have existed in this form. I felt a sense of profound accomplishment, mixed with awe and a lingering sense of mystery. How could something this big remain undiscovered, or at least unmapped? I took out my compass and GPS, orienting myself. The lowest point appeared to be near the center of the depression, as the 3D model had suggested. I decided to traverse towards it, exploring the floor and looking for any further clues about the origin and nature of this hidden place. The ground underfoot varied. Sometimes soft sand that made walking difficult, sometimes firm, rocky soil. I noted how the small arroyos from the rim converged towards the center, creating shallow drainage channels that would funnel water during rain events. This central area would likely be a temporary pond or marsh after heavy rain, explaining the denser vegetation there. As I walked towards the center, I kept an eye on the surrounding slopes. They rose dramatically on all sides, forming a protective barrier against the outside world. The rock layers were more visible from this angle, displaying the geological history of the area laid bare by whatever event created the depression. I saw what looked like fault lines or fractures running through the layers in some places, possibly caused by the immense forces involved in the formation. I took photographs, noting the appearance of different rock types and structures. I wasn't a geologist by formal training, but my years of surveying had given me a good working knowledge of geological features and processes. This felt like a masterclass in planetary sculpting, played out on a grand scale in the Texas wilderness. The mystery of its absence from maps only deepened with every step. This wasn't a minor, easily overlooked feature. It was a colossal hole in the ground, large enough to contain a small town. Its very existence challenged my understanding of how comprehensively our world had been documented. Walking across the floor of the depression was an exercise in shifting perspective. The slopes surrounding me seemed to change angle and texture depending on my position. Up close, the scale felt immense, each ridge and gully a significant obstacle or feature in itself. Looking back towards the section of the rim I'd descended, it looked like a formidable wall I had somehow managed to navigate. The center of the depression was not a single, flat point, but rather a broad, slightly undulating area, the lowest part of the basin. The vegetation here was noticeably different. Thicker clumps of grass, more variety in the brush, and even a few small thorny trees that looked healthier than their counterparts outside the rim. This confirmed that water gathered and lingered here, creating a more favorable microclimate. I spent time in this central area, taking measurements with my handheld GPS for elevation and position. The elevation reading was consistent with the deepest point indicated by my drone's 3D model, around 145 meters below the average elevation of the surrounding plain. I also used the rangefinder to measure the distances to various points on the rim, cross-referencing them with my aerial data. The ground measurements were consistent with the drone survey, solidifying the scale of the feature, over 1 kilometer across. I looked closely at the ground around the center. The soil was a mix of fine sand, clay, and alluvial deposits washed down from the slopes. There were also scattered rocks, some angular and clearly derived from the rim erosion, others more rounded, perhaps transported by ancient water flow or indicative of material ejected and fallen back into the basin during its formation. I didn't see any obvious signs of melt rock or exotic materials that would definitively point to a meteorite impact, but identifying such evidence requires specialized geological knowledge and equipment for analysis. My visual inspection and basic tools were insufficient for that level of detail. I took photographs of different rock types I saw on the floor and slopes, hoping I could identify them later or show them to a geologist. The layered sedimentary rocks were clearly visible on the slopes, tilted or fractured in places, hinting at the forces that had shaped the bowl. I also observed what looked like breccia, angular rock fragments cemented together, in some areas near the base of the slopes. Breccia can form in several ways, including faulting, volcanic activity, and impact events. Its presence here was another clue, but not conclusive on its own. I spent the entire afternoon exploring the floor, walking towards different sections of the rim, observing the variations in the slopes and the terrain. I found what looked like several small ephemeral ponds, depressions where water would collect after rain. Some had dried mud cracks, indicating recent moisture. This confirmed the basin acted as a natural catchment. I also saw abundant signs of wildlife. Deer trails crisscrossing the floor, scat from coyotes and smaller carnivores, bird nests in the bushes, and numerous insects. The crater floor was a hidden ecological niche, a sheltered world supporting a variety of life. It felt strangely peaceful, cut off from the wind and the vast, empty horizon outside. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows and painting the crater walls in warm hues, I knew I needed to start thinking about heading back. Descending into the crater had been tricky. Ascending out of it, especially after a long day of exploring, would require effort. I chose the same gully I had used for descent, as it was the path I was familiar with and knew was relatively stable. The climb out was strenuous. I had to use my hands frequently, pulling myself up over rocky steps and scrambling over loose scree. The setting sun meant the slopes were cooling down, which was a relief, but it also meant I needed to be careful not to be caught by darkness on the rim. I reached the rim as the last light was fading from the sky. The view from the top, looking out over the vast, darkening plain, felt different after spending hours inside the enclosed world of the crater. The familiar Texas landscape now seemed incredibly open, vulnerable, compared to the sheltered depth I had just left. I sat on the rim for a few minutes, catching my breath, watching the stars begin to appear in the inky sky. The Milky Way was a brilliant band overhead, unaffected by light pollution out here. It was a reminder of the cosmic scale, perhaps hinting at the origin of the feature below. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional call of a nightbird. I pulled out my satellite phone and sent a brief check-in message to my emergency contact, my sister, who knew generally where I was and when I expected to be back in touch. The satellite phone worked reliably out here, unlike any terrestrial signal. With the data collected, the photos taken, and the experience of walking its floor, the giant unmapped crater was no longer just an anomaly on a screen. It was a real place, a tangible geographical feature of immense scale and mysterious origins. The question of its absence from maps felt more pressing than ever. Was it possible that no surveyor, no geologist, no one in the past century or more had stumbled upon this and reported it? Or had they, and their findings had been ignored, lost, or deliberately suppressed? The latter seemed improbable for a feature of this size outside of military or highly sensitive contexts, neither of which seemed applicable here based on my observations. The most likely explanation remained a combination of extreme remoteness, private land ownership, and the simple fact that sometimes even large things can be overlooked if no one with the means and motivation happens to look in the right way, like comparing satellite data to outdated maps, or happens to be traversing that specific difficult terrain. Yet it still felt profoundly strange. I made my way back from the rim in the fading light, guided by my GPS and the faint glow of the stars. Finding my way back to the dry wash was straightforward enough, and walking its sandy bed in the dark, using a headlamp, was easier than navigating the brush. I moved carefully, listening for any sounds, though I heard nothing but the wind and my own footsteps. Reaching the old gate I'd slipped through felt like crossing a threshold back into the slightly more known world, even though I was still miles from paved road and officially on private land. I wired the gate shut again, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible, the guilt pricking at me again. I knew this wasn't ideal, but the desire to document this place felt paramount. I still had a long walk back to where I'd left the truck. The night was cool, the air crisp and clear. The solitude was immense, almost palpable. It was just me, the stars, and the knowledge of the giant hidden crater sitting silently out in the darkness behind me. The truck was exactly where I'd left it, well hidden. Getting in, I felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with exhilaration. I had done it. I had found the unmapped crater, confirmed its existence and scale, and even managed to explore its depths. But the work wasn't over. The next step was to analyze all the data, try to determine the origin of the feature, and figure out how to bring this hidden piece of geography to light. And that, I suspected, might be even more challenging than finding it had been. The world of maps and official knowledge is often resistant to undocumented anomalies, particularly ones of this scale and in such an unexpected location. I started the truck, the engine roaring to life, shattering the desert silence. I carefully maneuvered back onto the faint track, beginning the slow, bumpy journey back towards the county road. The crater remained behind me, a dark, silent bowl under the stars, still holding its secrets, still waiting for the rest of the world to acknowledge its existence. Back in the comfort of my home office, surrounded by monitors and geological texts, the sheer volume of data I'd collected felt almost overwhelming. The high-resolution drone photos, the 3D model, the video footage, my GPS tracks, elevation data, field notes and photographs from inside the crater. It was all there, demanding analysis. I spent weeks poring over it. The 3D model was the most powerful tool. I could slice it, view cross-sections, calculate volumes, and measure angles with precision. The elliptical shape was clear, its major axis aligned roughly northeast-southwest, a common characteristic of impact craters formed by objects striking at an oblique angle. The rim varied in height and structure. Some sections showed a distinct uplifted lip, while others were more eroded or appeared to have slumped inward. Inside, the slopes showed clear layering of sedimentary rock formations. I tried to correlate these layers with published geological cross-sections of the broader Trans-Pecos region, which were available from the Bureau of Economic Geology. It wasn't an exact match, as the local stratigraphy could vary, but it gave me a general idea of the rock types I was looking at, likely a sequence of Cretaceous-age limestones, shales, and sandstones. The presence of what looked like brecciated rock in some areas, particularly at the base of the slopes and on the crater floor near the edges, further supported a high-energy formation event, either a massive impact or a catastrophic collapse. The drainage patterns within the crater were evident in the 3D model, showing how water would funnel towards the central low point. This confirmed my observation about the differing vegetation on the floor. There were no obvious signs of volcanic activity, no solidified lava flows, volcanic ash layers, unless highly eroded, or a central volcanic plug. While ancient volcanic maars can sometimes resemble impact craters, the regional geology and the visible rock layers didn't strongly support a volcanic origin for a feature of this size here. A large sinkhole or collapse structure was still a possibility. Massive underground voids, perhaps created by the dissolution of salt layers or certain types of limestone, could collapse to form large surface depressions. However, the relatively high, well-defined rim and the apparent presence of uplifted or overturned strata around the edge, suggested by the angles of the rock layers visible in some areas, are less typical of simple sinkholes and more characteristic of impact structures, or perhaps a complex form of collapse involving faulting and uplift. After weeks of analysis, comparing the features to known geological structures and impact sites around the world, my conclusion solidified. The most likely origin of the unmapped crater was a meteorite impact. The size, shape, raised rim, and visible geological disturbance patterns were all highly consistent with an eroded complex impact crater. The fact that I hadn't found definitive impact melt rock or shatter cones, microscopic or macroscopic features unique to impact events, wasn't surprising. These can be buried, eroded away, or require detailed, on-site geological sampling and laboratory analysis to confirm. My evidence was strong, but circumstantial. The next logical step was to get this information to the scientific community. A confirmed impact crater of this size in the continental United States is a significant discovery. It would be of interest to geologists, planetary scientists, and geophysicists. I compiled all my findings into a preliminary report. The location, dimensions based on my photogrammetry, the 3D model, selected annotated photographs showing geological features, and my analysis supporting an impact origin. I decided to contact the Bureau of Economic Geology, BEG, at the University of Texas at Austin. They are the state's primary geological survey and research unit, and the most appropriate body to report such a finding to. I sent an email to the head of the relevant research division, attaching my preliminary report and explaining my background as a retired surveyor who had found an anomaly through remote sensing and followed up with a drone survey and field reconnaissance. I tried to keep the tone professional and factual, avoiding any sensationalism or claims of a grand conspiracy regarding its unmapped status. I simply presented the data and my interpretation. I waited and waited. After a week, I received a polite generic email from an administrative assistant acknowledging receipt of my report and stating it would be forwarded to the appropriate researcher. Another 2 weeks passed with no further contact. I sent a follow-up email, politely inquiring about the status of my submission. This time, I received a brief response from a staff geologist. They thanked me for the information, acknowledged that the feature appeared significant based on my data, but stated that they received many reports of potential geological anomalies, particularly in remote areas. They explained that verifying such features required significant resources, field geologists, potentially geophysical surveys, drilling, and that their research priorities were typically focused on areas with known resources or existing research projects. They implied that while interesting, my finding was, for now, low on their priority list. They encouraged me to publish my findings in a peer-reviewed journal if I wished to gain wider scientific attention. The response, while not dismissive, was definitely underwhelming. They weren't jumping at the chance to investigate a potentially significant impact crater. This confirmed one of my initial thoughts. Even major geological features can be overlooked if they aren't in an area of current scientific or economic interest. And if the report comes from an independent, unaffiliated individual like myself, lacking academic credentials or institutional backing, reporting it to a peer-reviewed journal seemed like the next logical step. But that route is also challenging. Scientific journals require rigorous data, often demand specific types of geological analysis I wasn't equipped to perform, like analyzing rock samples for shock features or isotopic dating, and the peer review process can be lengthy and critical. Furthermore, publishing would require revealing the precise location which, while scientifically necessary, felt like a violation of the privacy of the landowners, however unintentional my initial trespass had been. And there was still the question of access for any future, more detailed scientific study. No reputable journal would publish a paper about a feature that couldn't be accessed by other researchers for verification. The legal hurdle of land access remained. I decided to try contacting the landowners again, this time with a more specific and professional approach. Armed with my detailed report and the backing of my confirmed measurements and analysis, even if the BEG hadn't prioritized it. I wrote letters to the holding companies and individuals listed in the county records, explaining my findings, providing a summary of the report, and requesting formal permission to conduct a non-intrusive scientific study of the feature. I emphasized that I was a retired professional surveyor and amateur geologist, not a treasure hunter or a developer, and that the purpose was purely scientific documentation. I included copies of some of my drone images and the 3D model visualization to demonstrate the nature and scale of the feature on their property. I offered to sign waivers of liability and to share all my findings with them. Again, I waited. And again, the response was muted. One holding company sent a form letter acknowledging receipt but stating they had no interest in allowing third parties onto their property for any purpose. The other family-owned ranch responded after several weeks with a brief, polite email from a ranch manager. They stated they were aware of the large depression on their land, so it wasn't a total secret to them, considered it a natural feature and a hazard, and were not interested in allowing researchers or any visitors access. They cited liability and privacy concerns. They weren't hostile, just firm. We prefer to keep our land private, and that includes its geographic features. The email essentially conveyed. This was a dead end, at least for now. Without landowner permission, formal scientific study, publication in a major journal, and potential official mapping were effectively blocked. The reality settled in. I had discovered a significant, likely impact crater, potentially one of the largest previously uncatalogued geological features in the United States. And it was destined to remain off the map, known only to me and the few people I had contacted who chose to ignore or dismiss it. The sheer irony was stark. I, a mapmaker by trade, had found a giant blank space on the map, and now I was being prevented from filling it in. It was frustrating, but also in a strange way, solidified the mystery of the place. It wasn't on the map because it was hidden, not just by remoteness, but by privacy, indifference, and the logistical hurdles of accessing and documenting remote private land. My personal quest had led me to a remarkable discovery, but also to the boundary between private property and public knowledge, a boundary that in this case was heavily fortified. I could, of course, publish my findings online, on a blog or a niche forum, sharing my data with other amateur geologists or remote sensing enthusiasts. This seemed like the most viable option for disseminating the information without requiring formal permission or breaching scientific publication protocols I couldn't fully meet. It wouldn't lead to the crater appearing on official maps or being formally studied, but it would at least ensure that the information wasn't lost. It would become a known, unofficial feature, a geographical ghost story whispered among those who look beyond the lines on the map. I began preparing a detailed online presentation of my findings, compiling the most compelling images, the 3D model, and a narrative of my discovery and analysis. It felt like a compromise, not the official recognition the feature deserved, but a way to ensure its existence was acknowledged by someone beyond myself and the uninterested landowners. The crater, silent and hidden in the vast Texas landscape, would remain off the grid, a monument to the overlooked and the inaccessible, a testament to the fact that even in the 21st century there are still giant secrets held by the land itself. The process of compiling my findings for an online audience felt like assembling evidence for a jury that might never convene. I organized the drone footage, selecting clips that best showed the scale and form of the depression. I rendered various views of the 3D model, highlighting the rim, the slopes, and the relatively flat floor. I annotated photographs taken both from the air and from inside the crater, pointing out visible rock layers, suspected fault lines, and areas of breccia. I wrote descriptions of my field observations, detailing the terrain, vegetation, and the profound sense of isolation I felt. I included my GPS tracks and elevation profiles, providing concrete geographical data. I also wrote about my attempts to get the feature recognized by the Bureau of Economic Geology and the landowners, describing the polite but firm rejections. I chose to host everything on a simple website and link to it from a few online forums dedicated to geology, remote sensing, and unexplained geographical phenomena. It wasn't the formal scientific publication I'd initially hoped for, but it felt like the most realistic way to share my discovery and perhaps connect with others who might be interested or have insights. The initial reaction online was mixed. Some people were immediately fascinated, asking questions about the location, the geology, and the potential origin. They shared links to known impact structures and geological formations, offering comparisons and suggestions. Others were skeptical, suggesting alternative explanations like salt dissolution collapse, or simply questioning the accuracy of my data without academic peer review. A few suspected it might be a known feature, perhaps misidentified, or simply not popularly known. But I had done my homework. I had checked every available database and map I could find. This specific feature at these precise coordinates was not listed as a named or studied geological site. The most common reaction, however, was one of surprise that something this large could exist and remain undocumented. People found the idea of a missing giant crater compelling. The discussion generated on the forums and via emails was stimulating. Several amateur geologists and remote sensing enthusiasts offered to help analyze the data further or suggest additional lines of inquiry. One person suggested looking for evidence of shock metamorphism in the rocks, which is a definitive indicator of impact. Another suggested looking for gravitational or magnetic anomalies over the site using publicly available geophysical data, as impact craters often leave a detectable geophysical signature. These were avenues I hadn't fully explored or lacked the expertise to interpret accurately. The online community, informal as it was, offered a way to continue the investigation collaboratively. While I continued to engage with the online community and refine my presentation based on their feedback and suggestions, the fundamental barrier remained: physical access to the site for detailed geological sampling. Without permission from the landowners, any further investigation requiring boots on the ground was impossible or legally risky. I considered contacting the landowners again, perhaps framing the request differently, maybe through a third party like a local historical society or a non-profit geological group if I could find one willing to take on the project. But I knew Texas ranch owners could be fiercely independent and resistant to outside interference regardless of the intermediary. The hazard and privacy explanation they had given seemed simple and final. They had a big hole on their land. They knew about it. They didn't want anyone visiting it or making a fuss. End of story from their perspective. It was their right, of course, but frustrating from a scientific standpoint. The giant crater, a potentially significant piece of Earth's history, was locked away behind private property lines and a desire for solitude. I found myself frequently looking at the satellite images and the 3D model on my computer screen. The feature became a constant presence in my thoughts, a silent geographical entity that defied the maps I had dedicated my life to. I started to think about other undocumented or poorly documented features I might have encountered over the years, places that didn't quite fit the lines drawn on paper. Perhaps the Texas crater wasn't unique in being hidden, just unique in its scale. It made me question the completeness of our geographical knowledge. Even in an age of ubiquitous satellite imagery and mapping technology, official maps, I realized even more acutely, are often products of specific purposes: navigation, property delineation, resource management. They don't necessarily capture every single natural feature, especially if it doesn't serve those purposes or is located in inaccessible areas. But a feature this size felt like an exception, something that should have been deemed significant enough to record. The lack of documentation felt deliberate in its effect, if not in its intent. It wasn't that it couldn't be mapped. It simply hadn't been, or any record of it had been ignored. I decided to make one more attempt at formal documentation, albeit through a less conventional route. I contacted the Lunar and Planetary Institute, LPI, in Houston. LPI is a research institute dedicated to studying the solar system, and they maintain databases of known impact craters on Earth and other planets. While my evidence was circumstantial, I thought they might be interested in a potential new terrestrial impact site, even if access was currently restricted. I sent them my report, emphasizing the strong likelihood of an impact origin based on morphology and scale. Their response was more encouraging than the BEG's. A research scientist there replied, expressing interest in the data. They acknowledged that my evidence was compelling, but like the BEG, stressed the need for definitive geological proof, shock metamorphism, specific mineral alterations, or geophysical anomalies. They added the feature to their internal list of candidate impact structures, noting its location and my data, but explained it would not be added to official public databases of confirmed impact craters without further verification. They suggested contacting specific researchers known for studying Texas geology or impact structures and offered to forward my information if I wished. This was a small step, but significant. My discovery was now acknowledged, however tentatively, by an institute that tracks such things. It wasn't on official maps yet, but it was on a list of potential scientific interest. The interactions, both online and with institutions, confirmed the complex nature of geographical knowledge. It's not just about finding something. It's about documenting it according to accepted standards, navigating institutional processes, and often dealing with the realities of land ownership and access. The giant crater in Texas remained, for the vast majority of people and official records, a non-existent feature. My website and forum posts served as an unofficial appendix to the state's geography, a footnote about a massive hole in the ground that wasn't supposed to be there. I continued to monitor the area using publicly available satellite data whenever new images were released. But nothing changed. The crater sat there, silent and still, a permanent part of the landscape that maps chose to ignore. It became, for me, a symbol of the limits of our documented world, a reminder that even in the age of satellites, there are still places and features that remain hidden, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps simply waiting to be left alone. The mystery of its unmapped status, once a source of frustration, began to evolve into a quiet acceptance of the land's ability to hold its own secrets. The giant crater in Texas, the one missing from every official map I've ever seen, remains a private fascination, a testament to the unexpected discoveries still possible in a seemingly thoroughly explored world. It sits out there, in the vast, empty heart of the Trans-Pecos, a silent, massive bowl scooped into the earth, known to a handful of people who own the land, a few scientists who received my unsolicited reports, and a small online community who stumbled upon my website. For everyone else, it simply doesn't exist on paper. My initial frustration at the lack of official recognition has softened over time, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in having found it at all. It's a reminder that maps, while powerful tools, are abstractions of reality, filtered and constructed for specific purposes. They tell us a great deal, but they don't necessarily tell us everything. The reasons for its absence from the official record are likely a combination of factors, none individually sensational, but cumulatively effective. Extreme remoteness, difficult terrain, being located entirely on private land whose owners value their privacy above all else, and the simple fact that comprehensive, high-resolution topographical surveys of every square mile of a large state are prohibitively expensive and often only conducted for specific reasons. While I strongly suspect it's an impact crater, a definitive scientific classification still requires field work, geophysical surveys, and laboratory analysis of samples, all activities that are currently blocked by the access issue. It remains on the Lunar and Planetary Institute's list of candidate impact structures, a sort of purgatory for potential discoveries awaiting confirmation. I check back on my website and the forums occasionally, There are still questions, still discussions. Other remote sensing enthusiasts sometimes contact me, sharing their own observations or asking for higher resolution data if I have it. The 3D model I created has been downloaded and viewed by people all over the world, allowing them to virtually explore the feature I physically visited. It's a form of dissemination, a way for the crater to become unofficially known, existing in digital space even if it's absent from the printed maps and online atlases most people use. My journey to find and document the crater changed my perspective. It reinforced my love for maps and geographical data, but it also taught me humility about their limitations. It showed me that even in the 21st century, there are still significant geographical mysteries waiting to be uncovered, not necessarily in unexplored territories, but in the overlooked corners of places we thought we knew. The experience of standing on the rim, looking down into that vast, silent bowl, and then walking on its floor, felt like stepping outside of the documented world. It was a profound connection with the raw, unedited landscape, a landscape that held a secret thousands of feet deep and over a kilometer wide. The silence of the crater, the feeling of being cut off from the world outside its rim, is something that stays with me. It was a natural sanctuary, a place shaped by immense forces long ago, now quietly existing, mostly unnoticed. I sometimes wonder if anyone else has stumbled upon it over the years. Hunters, hikers, ranch hands. The landowners are aware of it. That much is clear, but their awareness seems limited to acknowledging its existence as a large depression on their property, rather than a feature of scientific significance. Perhaps that's for the best. The thought of the area being overrun by tourists or researchers, its quiet solitude disturbed, is unappealing. The unmapped crater is a reminder that our picture of the world is always incomplete, a work in progress. There are gaps, not just in remote jungles or ocean depths, but in familiar landscapes, hidden in plain sight by virtue of their location, ownership, or simply the limitations of our mapping efforts. My discovery of the giant crater in Texas that's not on any official map is a small story in the grand scheme of geographical exploration. But it's a story that fundamentally altered my understanding of maps and the land they represent. It taught me that the most exciting discoveries aren't always about finding something entirely new, but sometimes about recognizing something massive and ancient that has been there all along, simply waiting for someone to notice that it was missing from the picture. And so, the giant crater remains, unnamed, unmapped on official charts, a ghost on the landscape, a secret held by the vast Texas earth, a silent, enduring mystery in a world that thinks it has seen everything. I have my data, my photos, my memories of standing inside its immense, quiet embrace. That feels like enough. It exists, and for now, that knowledge, shared only with a small corner of the internet and a few uninterested officials, feels like a quiet triumph. The map has a blank spot, and I know what's there.